History 322, Week 4, Audio 1. Go to Slide 2. So this week we're going to talk about imperialism in Northeast Asia. Northeast Asia is supposed to include China, Japan, and Korea. And then Southeast Asia, we were talking about previously, the countries including Burma, Thailand, the Indo-Chinese countries, Malaysia, Indonesia. And Northeast Asia, technically speaking, includes all of China, down to the Vietnamese border and out to Xinjiang. It's nothing to get technical about, but it's the way people tend to write about them. Going on to Slide 3. So imperialism. It's almost, well, it is a pejorative term nowadays, but it's also a technical term, and it refers to countries taking over other territory than their own in order to build up national power, in order to promote economic activity that is of benefit to the home country, not necessarily of any benefit to the victim peoples. We covered some aspects of Japan's entry into Korea last week. This week I want to focus on what happened in Korea and what happened in China. Korea has been called in English the Hermit Kingdom. You'll see readings in Robinson and Gordon. Take a look at these notes, look at the PowerPoint version of this presentation. I've got notes down below that has a bit more than I plan to say, if I can stop myself from being long-winded. And there's a reading as well about the nature of imperialism as practiced by Japan, since it became so important. Overall, of course, the period of the 19th century opened with imperialist activity by the British after the, during and after the First Opium War from 1839 to 42, and wrapped up with Britain still being the dominant imperialist power in East Asia, but with lots of followers on, including the United States. And then after World War I, the reason that Japan is so important is that it stepped in. It began to impinge on the imperialist territory, the imperial territory of these other foreign powers. But make no mistake, Britain and the other foreign powers from the West, as well as Japan, expended massive efforts to carve up China and to, in the case of the Japanese, take over Korea entirely. The powers had each of their own self-images, which seemed to have, roughly speaking, two elements. Number one, we're bringing light and civilized culture to our colonial peoples. And number two, being a successful colonizer gives our nation purpose, meaning, power, including real economic power that figured into what I would argue is the idea of national survival. So these self-justifications were partly for private consumption, but generally speaking were quite a bit also for public consumption, not only in countries with governments that were elected and therefore accountable to voters to some degree, but also in other countries that were sensitive for other reasons to public opinion. I used to hear, for example, from my Portuguese relatives, just remember, Portugal is not a small country. And this was a slogan that came from the period of the right-wing dictatorship between 1926 and 1974. And it was interesting as well, these different approaches to colonization. Some of the colonizers intermarried with their victim peoples, such as the Portuguese and the French, and others, the Germans and the British, did not. They tended to stay quite separate from the colonized peoples. And then there were the Americans, which I would argue were sort of in the middle. Going on to slide 4. We'll read a bit this week about social Darwinist motivations of Japan. What is social Darwinism? You know Darwin, the founder of the theory of evolution. Social Darwinism, you've probably read about in other courses, refers to the idea that the strongest nation, not only the strongest species, but the strongest nation will prevail. And these social Darwinist ideas that we must stay ahead, we must stay strong, we must grow, certainly were a driving force behind imperialist expansion in the 19th century and into the 20th century as well. Did the U.S. also have such a drive to stay ahead, or at least up along with the Joneses, with the other powers, in its own colonial holdings from Puerto Rico to the Philippines? Sounds like an interesting extra credit paper. Going on to slide 5. And so, that optional Beasley reading, which explains, it's not an easy reading, but it explains imperialism fairly well, especially Japanese imperialism. If you've studied anything about Russia, you may have learned about Lenin, who wrote the famous tract Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where he makes the argument that as capitalism develops in industrialized countries, there eventually is so much capital that the home market can no longer absorb it. So therefore, these countries seek outlets for capital, and that's why they use their military to expand into other places to take them over and turn them into places that can be used to absorb all that excess capital and therefore make more and more of it. Another good potential extra credit paper. How did Lenin's work apply to China at the time of publication in 1905? Was Lenin thinking of Britain when he was writing about imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism? Was he thinking of Japan? Was he thinking of Russia? You can see in the Beasley reading that he makes the argument that Japan had its own variety of imperialism. Before 1904, it was defensive. After 1904, it focused on social Darwinist concepts of the strong prevailing. After 1918, very different. The idea then began to evolve of Japan leading a movement of Asia for the Asians to throw out the Western colonial powers. Very different sort of motivation set from what the British had. Going on to slide 6. The beginning of all this in Northeast Asia was with the British. The Macartney mission. Macartney was a British noble sent by the Crown to China to attempt to establish a permanent embassy there to promote bilateral relations and therefore, of course, promote trade. At this time, you remember the Boston Tea Party, not the Tea Party of today's fame, but the Tea Party in 1774, 75, I think it was. The Boston Tea Party dumping Chinese tea into the ocean in order to stop the British from collecting tax on it. Big market in the Americas and in Europe for tea. At this time, the British wanted to try to reverse this balance of payments problem they were having with China. Too much silver flowing to the east in exchange for these highly developed, highly refined, highly desired consumer goods in the West. Not only tea, but also ceramics and silks. So there's all this rising demand, and it was an old problem, really. It was a problem that had existed hundreds of years ago, as I briefly write about in the last part of this slide. I don't want to get into it here. But recall that our British friends were also, at this time, besides wanting to plant opium and sell it into China eventually, as they did, as well as wanting to find a way to avoid so many Chinese imports. They were engaged in a little bit of technological theft themselves, like the Byzantines engaged in early techno theft from China by bringing home silkworm eggs. The British had absconded with rubber seeds from Brazil. You remember that from, I think, last week. So the big thing was to reverse this flow of silver, one-way flow of silver, and so the British started to cultivate both tea and opium after being rebuffed by the Chinese. Going on to slide 7. People smoked opium then. They smoked opium in places like Singapore. They smoked opium in China. And today people still do smoke opium, as you undoubtedly know, as well as injecting its refined form as heroin. That's why opiumaddiction.com exists. If you smoke opium or take heroin or hooked on pills, I've known some people who've done that. I would like you to come and see me. I'm an experienced counselor. I can help you get help without calling the police. But that's not the point of this course. The point of this course at this moment is to talk about how opium tore apart the Chinese social fabric as it spread from the lower classes to the upper classes. Of course, the Westerners who were importing this stuff didn't really care. They didn't have proper diplomatic relations with China. They were not concerned. These big companies like became Jardine Matheson, for example, their executives weren't concerned about maintaining reasonable bilateral relationship with the Chinese. They were interested in making money, and they didn't care if people became addicted to opium. As the situation grew worse during the first half of the 19th century, Chinese official attention began to focus on it. Going on to slide 8, and that's where this man came into the picture, Lin Zexu. There are two different spellings there, depending on which book you're reading. The one that's in parentheses is an older style. You'll see an account of Lin Zexu in the Westad book, one of those figures in society, very loosely, was similar in his position in society to people like David Petraeus or John Brennan, very well-known individuals. Today, Petraeus, of course, was the well-known commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. John Brennan is now the head of CIA. For years in Washington, D.C., he was known for saying, "I don't do downtime. All I do is work." A couple of people of unbelievable drive and talent, although they're human beings, as we've learned in the press. The same with Lin Zexu. He was one of those people, very talented, very educated, very driven. And he was directed by the emperor to end the opium problem once and for all. And he did for a little while by confiscating all the available stocks owned by the British, for the most part, in Canton, Guangzhou, and burning them. If you look at that letter he wrote to Queen Victoria saying, "How would you like it if someone brought poison to your country," and started handing it out to everybody, it actually makes a lot of sense. But, of course, the British didn't care about that. What they cared about was the profits to be made. And so, and I'm not saying that this is a particularly British problem, it is a people problem. It's a problem that people have. The British knew that they could likely win a war against China, and they were not about to let the Chinese stop this commercial activity. This war, going on to slide 9, was not over in a month or anything. It took 3 long years, partly, of course, because this was the era of the of the sailing ship, slave ship too, and moving enough troops, enough ships over to the Chinese coast to engage the Chinese and destroy their navy took a lot of time. So many profits to make, so much money, so little time. Lives of ordinary people are not important in these considerations when you examine how national leaders make such decisions. Going on, slide 10. But 1842, the year that the British won the first Opium War, was not a year of endless victory parades for the British Army. 1842 was also a year when there was this huge disaster in Afghanistan. 700 European soldiers, 3,800 Indians, 1,400 civilian staff, some of whom were also British, fled Kabul, Afghanistan, to the west, hoping to get to somewhere else. And only one person survived to reach Jalalabad, an enormous disaster. Now, there are so many things to talk about here. I want to make a few quick points. One is that the British Navy could not be involved because Afghanistan is a landlocked country. Therefore, the British Army was on their own. The technology gap between an advanced army at that time and a less than advanced army was not very wide because there was no mobility other than the horse. There were no armored vehicles, and so on. There was no air power. The gap between low-tech and high-tech forces, on the other hand, on the ocean was much wider because there was more of a difference in fire and maneuverability on the water than there was on land. So the British could dominate the Chinese because that war was fought along the Chinese coast. The British could not dominate the Afghans for various reasons, mostly because their advanced rifles and cannon were less of an advantage than they would have been on the water. And another thing to keep in mind about this, just tuck it away in your back pocket for later weeks, is that Afghanistan is what? It is a mountainous and relatively dry place. It is a place where something like opium can flourish. Opium flourishes in dry and poor places because it's such a hardy plant. And since it flourishes, and things like wheat do not always flourish and other kinds of grain, this means that farmers can grow opium and make a lot of money in very poor places. That was true back then, and of course it's true today. And this became an issue during the Chinese Communist Revolution, when the Chinese Communists were holed up in Yan'an in China's northwest between 1936 and the end of World War II. They allowed and encouraged and closely controlled the cultivation of opium that was sent into Japanese and nationalist Chinese controlled areas, their adversaries, because it messed things up and they're behind the lines of the enemy, and it made a lot of money. And Yan'an, in the northwest there, is a poor and dry area. So what's there not to like, in essence? Today in Afghanistan, to come back to the whole thing about technological gaps between forces, there's no U.S. Navy activity of any appreciable sort in Afghanistan, being a landlocked country. There's superior air power, there's superior firepower, yet in spite of the fact that the U.S. rules the skies, it is having trouble prosecuting the war in Afghanistan. And so this difference in technological gap and what it means between land forces persists even to this day. We'll continue now with audio 2 and slide 11.